All right, let's get started. My name is Ananth. I am a professor of economics at UW-Madison. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. And we're just delighted to have Speaker Voss here today. I want to say a little bit about CROWE. It's a market-oriented center based in the economics department within the College of Letters and Science. Our mission is basically to study research specific to the Wisconsin economy and have events such as these where we have a civil and open exchange of ideas. Over the last year or so, we wrote a series of papers, a nerdy series of papers titled The Economics of UW-Madison, which dealt with issues about bonding authority, tuition, what better could we do to serve the state of Wisconsin, and what better could the state do to set us up for success. And I thought it'd be good to have folks in power come here and having a fireside conversation, invited people from both sides of the aisle, and just really delighted that Speaker Voss is able to join us here today. In some exciting news for our center, our tiny little center, my co-director, Kim Roll, has been appointed as Trump's member of the Council of Economic Advisors. This is the first time in the history of UW-Madison that an economics professor or any professor has been appointed to the council. The only other person who was ever a faculty member to have been in the council was Becky Blank. That was when she was at Northwestern and was served under President Clinton. So please get a big round of applause for Kim Roll. Thank you. Okay, so I want to just get started. I don't think the speaker needs a whole lot of introduction, but I do want to introduce him. Speaker Voss is Wisconsin Assembly's longest serving speaker. He was first elected to office as a speaker in 2013, I have that right. Before being elected to the Wisconsin State Assembly in 2004, the speaker served in the Racine County Board for 10 years. During his tenure on the board, he played an important role in shaping the county budget by serving as the chair of the Finance Committee. He runs many small businesses in Southeast Wisconsin and has successfully grown a small 3-person family-operated business to a much more significant operation that employs more than 100 employees, thanks to his laser focus in customer service. He received his degree from UW-Whitewater in 1991 with a double major in political science and public relations. During college, Speaker Voss developed a passion for public service and became active in student government. He was appointed by Governor Tommy Thompson as a student representative on the UW Board of Regents. Please join me in welcoming Speaker Voss. Thank you for being here, Speaker, and congratulations on your victory. Yeah. So the way I was thinking we would proceed is kind of in a nerdy sort of way. Start off with some history, the history behind the merger. We talk about the Biddy Martin saga, public autonomy, and then talk a little bit about budgets, eventually get into the thorny issue of DEI, and then eventually where do we go from here? I want to be very clear, always say this, but these are my own views. Don't associate them with anybody else's views in the university, not even CROWE, not the Department of Economics, not my college, not UW-Madison. See, these are my views and mine alone, especially when I go off script. All right, so Speaker, as someone who's been involved with UW system and Madison since your days as a student regent, I'd be curious to hear your experiences as a student regent in the mid-90s.
Well, first of all, good evening. Thank you all for being here and braving the snow. I appreciate you taking the time. I see we have some special guests here. First of all, Chairman Murphy from the Assembly University Committee, Representative Nidweski, who chaired the study committee, and probably most importantly, the most generous person in the room, Marv Levy, who has been super good to the university. So let's give him a round of applause. So, I started in student government back in 1986. So many of you were not even born then. But I was involved in student government. I ran for the student senate as a freshman. Got involved right away. I loved going to UW-Whitewater. It was an amazing experience. I would not be who I am today if I did not have a great experience in college, giving an opportunity to have viewpoints all over the board. Back then, you were kind of allowed to think and say anything, and there wasn't a whole lot of judgment. Sad part is, fast forward to today, and I don't think that's where universities are like they used to be. Used to be the place where sifting and winning of ideas happened all over. So I was actually chosen. Governor Thompson chose me as the 3rd student regent. The first student regent was a gentleman named John Shannon, who was chosen because he was the boyfriend of Governor Earl's daughter. That's how he was chosen. The second student regent was a nice gentleman from UW Milwaukee, who had not really been involved in student government, kind of controversial, than me. So the world was different back then. The Board of Regents was mostly comprised of significant donors, same way it is today, just they're chosen differently, but incredible people of integrity who love the university. So I got to sit next to, on one side, George Stile, Congressman Brian Stiles' grandfather, who was an amazing person. And on the other side was Lee Sherman Dreyfus. So it was just great. The thing that I learned the most, which shocked me as a young man, is that Lee Sherman Dreyfus, every night we had our meeting, he would drive home. And I leaned over to Governor Dreyfus and said, "Why do you do that?" And he said, "Because for the entire 53 years he had been married to his wife, not one night did he sleep not next to her in the bed." Right? So it made me realize, wow, there is a level of dedication from a public servant. Feel free. Just, that's $5 to CROWE. But it was a great experience where I got to meet people who had made a huge difference in Wisconsin, right? From the private sector, like Ab Nicholas was on the board. I mean, Paul Sullivan, who had been a Democrat appointee. So they were great people, but all of them had a common passion for the university. Not that we didn't agree on everything. There was lots of discussion and lots of debate. But at the time, the regents were the people who were truly the ambassadors for the state. They came from everywhere. They had all kinds of backgrounds, but they had a common mission to make the university the strongest it could possibly be. Now, that meant many times we would interact with the legislature. Right? It was different because back then, of course, it was a Democrat legislature, but a Republican governor. There seemed to be more of a consensus that working together was a stronger way to be able to make the university stronger. That mostly came from the regent side. I think their direction was just different than where it is now. It seems to be more confrontational. So it was just a different world. So I look at it as a very good time. It was only 2 years where I was a student regent, but it was a good experience, and I enjoyed it very much.
Were those some of the reasons why UW system as a whole and UW-Madison was incredibly well funded during the Tommy Thompson era? Because if you looked at the data, and we'll get to budgets more generically, but starting off historically, those were good times for UWs.
Mm-hmm. Well, they were good times for everybody.
Okay.
I mean, we had an awful lot of money coming into the state. Economic times were pretty prosperous nationwide. Don't forget, it was a time under Ronald Reagan and then George W. Bush, or George H.W. Bush. We had pretty good economic times. It had just been the fall of the Berlin Wall, so the economy was just different. Obviously, it was pre-internet, where, when I worked at the Capitol, I still had, to put in the paper where you would type on it. It would be like the copy. Most kids don't know what that is, but it was big at the time. So it's just a different world. And I feel like when we looked at the university, we did have a higher level of state support. There was no doubt. They had the balance where they tried to maintain approximately a third student tuition and 66% other funding. That was the goal that they had at the time. And then, of course, things changed.
Then we'll get back to budgets at a later point in time. I don't want to go back and talk a little bit about the merger. So there were two former governors, I think Rehnbaum and Kohler, in the 40s and 50s, were trying to get these different university systems merged. I believe one was the system which had Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Plattsville. Green Bay and Parkside, sorry. The other one was Wisconsin State University Systems. Several decades later, Lucy ended up merging the two systems. And the major reason it was given at the time was cost savings. Right? You'll be stronger together and you'll save more money. You avoid duplication. Do you feel as though the merger of the university systems was successful? What do you see as the benefits and costs associated with it?
Well, from the history that I have read, your analysis was correct. There were some other factors in there. One was the state teacher colleges. That was kind of one system. The other was more of the research arm and the two campuses that were added on. So I think there was some belief that at the time, every university should offer every opportunity, and it wasn't just about research versus education. The second thing, I think there was some political wrangling where, of course, you had one system pitted against the other fighting for funding, and they thought it would be more efficient to be together, to have one common vision for higher education. So yes, I think those were good. I think that merger as a concept was well thought out. I think it was a good idea. I think that the challenge that we have now is that the idea of merger was supposed to be speaking with a single vision and having a single focus. And I think that even when I was on the Board of Regents, we had something called Centers of Excellence, where you would try to have every campus be the best in the state at something, right? Whitewater had a fantastic business school. La Crosse had healthcare. Stevens Point was natural resources. You know, every campus had something. And then somehow over the course of the past 10 or 20 years, every campus has tried to be everything for everyone, really diluting the ability to be excellent in one area, trying to be excellent everywhere. And that rarely is successful. So the idea of merger was to be a system of equals with excellence everywhere, but not excellence at everything everywhere. And I think we've really gotten away from that idea, which is diluted funding. It's diluted the opportunity for students to say, I want to go to the best university for this one topic, as opposed to saying, I want to go to any program everywhere, where they're all good, but they might not be as excellent as they could be.
So I'd like to drill down the impact of the merger on flagship campuses.
Okay.
I'm just going to read a quote from a pretty well-known article. The article was titled, "Are Systems Bad for Flagships?" Not my article. So written by Bob Berdahl, Steve Sample, Raquel Rawl. I think Berdahl was a former chancellor at Austin, UT Austin, and Steve Sample was the president of USC, University of Southern California. Distinguished folks, no connection to Wisconsin, so no dog in the fight. So quote, "Despite the prevalence and best intentions of systems, it's not clear that good state systems any longer lead to good university governance. Indeed, it may be that university systems are inimical to the health of public flagship universities and to the states and regions they serve. As institutions have grown larger and more complex, it is more difficult for a single system board to oversee and govern them." And about Wisconsin in particular, they say, and I quote, "The merger in Wisconsin succeeded in moving the conflict from the legislature to the system itself, with the regional campuses often in opposition to the flagship Madison and the urban campus in Milwaukee. During the next decade, faculty salaries at Madison fell to the last place in the Big Ten. Efforts to overcome the gap were attacked by regional campuses. Between 1980 and 86, class size in Madison and Milwaukee increased by 17%, which is 70% more than the regional campuses. But Wisconsin represented a clear case in which the flagship research university suffered as a consequence of the creation of a single consolidated system." So time went on. For the longest time, I've been a faculty member here for 25 years. I've heard we need more flexibility, which is if you're a faculty member here, you're inviting someone to campus, you don't want to go through Fox World Travel or Concur. I think the folks in the room here understand what that is, which is someone somewhere is getting a kickback with that, and I don't know who that is. So it is not us, it is not the university. Anyway, so Biddy Martin made a pitch for autonomy. If memory serves me right, she made her pitch to Barrett, Walker, and Newman, who were the candidates running at the time. Governor Walker won. He adopted a more aggressive version of what she had pitched. I'm just wondering, were you supportive of Chancellor Martin's new Badger Partnership initiative?
I was. So at the time I chaired the Joint Finance Committee. Governor Walker put the proposal in the budget. I actually agreed with Governor Walker. I think he was right. I think that UW-Madison at the time, now perhaps it's different today, but I think at the time UW-Madison should have been spun off, should have been allowed to be its own entity with the balance of the system as its own entity as well. That's where I was.
I want to think a little bit about why this didn't happen. I want to also get to political polarizations. I know they are connected. I'll try to connect them. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on autonomy because, as you rightly, maybe this is not your words, but I'll put this in your mouth, which is there's probably no political path to autonomy at this point in time. Biddy Martin, in her exit interview with Isthmus, said, "What surprised me the most about this was there was no discussion on the merits. It became quickly a me versus them, a Madison kind of debate. I was hoping it would turn into a substantive discussion, not just about Madison, about UW-Madison, but higher ed, given the changes in the world. But I do know, I don't know what happened, but I do know that there were certain people who said to me they couldn't support it because it was part of Governor Walker's agenda." Do you feel as though the perceived political one-sidedness at UW-Madison hurt our chances of becoming a public authority?
I think it was, my memory is it was twofold. Yes. If Governor Walker proposed something, every Democrat said no. That was right during Act 10. There was a lot of political polarization. So I'll just give them the benefit of the doubt that they just reflexively said, if Governor Walker's for it, it must be a bad idea. They were wrong, but I think that's what they believed. The second half was, I was vigorously lobbied by every other chancellor in the system. I went to UW Whitewater, the Harvard of the Midwest. So I made sure that, I have affinity for my alma mater. And the chancellor at the time made a very compelling case to say that without UW-Madison, everybody else will be looked at as the second tier system. I disagreed. I still do. I still think that that if you look at the way the world works, UW-Madison, incredibly strong, has its own set of alumni, backers, people who graduated who love the campus, and they should. There's people who went to the other 12 campuses who also love their university. So I never saw a problem to say UW-Madison would have its champions and they would fight for funding for things that were important. And the rest of the system would probably have more graduates in the legislature, would probably have more advocates in the business community statewide. So I never perceived that they would be the redheaded stepchild. I kind of thought they might be the one who has more political weight to be able to get it done, as opposed to the rest. I'm sorry, I know. But I kind of look at it and think that it would have been stronger for both. That's why I thought it was a compelling case. But my recollection is, I mean, Evan Riley, the system chancellors, it was an all-out push saying that it would ruin the university. And my opinion, Democrats as lapdogs for whatever the university says, went along with that happily because they also hated Governor Walker. We put those two together and they all said no, when in reality, I think it would have made Madison stronger. I don't see any way it would have made the rest of the system weaker, but it never happened.
On your point, Catherine Lyle, the former president of UW system, is even more direct. She says in many ways, attempts by flagships to separate from their respective systems after the Great Recession began to see evidence of growing tensions between leaders who are attempting to respond to market challenges and opportunities, but feel constrained by what is perceived as outdated governance models. These cases illustrate a larger frustration that systems no longer help campus leaders obtain funds, buffer them from government intrusion and demands, or compete with other universities. They feel caught in regional structures and orientation while trying to compete in national global venues. Systems seemingly caught flat-footed by these wider visions of campus have responded by challenging or removing innovative presidents or protect traditional power, system power, rather than using these ideas to fashion new missions for both system and campus. Is that the kind of quote you would, this is the former UW system president who was probably responding to both Oregon, Wisconsin, and many other states where you saw that happen.
I think that's true. I agree with that. But I also think that we had a system where the Board of Regents was strong and powerful and influential. I have made a lot of mistakes. Any of the media here, you can quote me on that. I have made a lot of mistakes in my time as an elected official, right? You make a decision at the time that you think is best. You look back and you're like, that probably wasn't so smart. One of the ones that I look back and deeply regret was passing a bill that changed the way the Board of Regents was appointed. It used to be that the governor, whoever it was, got to pick the best people from around the state, whatever city they lived in, whatever geography, whatever school they graduated from, and they were chosen to be on the board. So they were usually influential community leaders, influential business leaders from all kinds of backgrounds. When I was on the Board of Regents, head of one of the major unions was on there, the head of one of the former chambers of commerce, all kinds of folks from around the state. We passed a bill which changed the rules to say that we now have to have 2 people from every congressional district. Theory, that's a nice idea. There's nothing wrong with that. What ends up happening is you don't find the same level of people with influence. You find people who feed a geographic pattern to say, well, I need 2 people from the 3rd congressional district. Who can I find? As opposed to, wow, these people love the university. They've been generous. They are good advocates. They are well connected. They would serve the university well. So I think that the people we have now on there, I am sure they are good and decent, so no harm intended. But I think that the influence level of how the Board of Regents operated has dramatically declined. And that has hurt the university because of the decision that we made that seemed to make the system more geographically balanced. So we didn't have everybody from Madison. That was the perception. I think the reality was we just weakened the board and that hurt the university.
The Biddy's case for autonomy, I want to bring that up, not to revisit old wounds, but the greater flexibilities, bonding authority, tuition, not viewing us as a state agency is about as relevant today, in my view. Biddy, on her exit interview, I think with the Badger Herald, said, to your point about the other chancellors being opposed, we try to get people together. We asked other chancellors if they'd be willing to meet together and talk about a compromise. I talked with 4 or 5 of them on the phone. All of them said it was a great idea. We made a plan and set a date and a place. I alerted President Riley and he canceled the meeting. So there was no sifting and winnowing clearly at that time. Do you feel as though the Ledge Council this past summer with Representative Nedwesky kind of served the purpose of sifting and winnowing and thinking a little bit about the future of UW system? Did you feel as though there were any implications from the Ledge Council, from the Legislative Council Study Committee that you feel as though might become something you'll think seriously about it?
I think they did a really good job. I think that it was It's a hard conversation to have because what I've learned, look, there are lots of things that I wish the world would be different on, but the one thing that I have learned about politics today is it is super incredibly hard for people to say, maybe I was wrong, right? And that's both parties, every level of government. It's human nature now to not want to admit that maybe we could have done things different. So looking back, it's hard for people to say, especially on the left, maybe we should have adopted this model to have more autonomy for UW-Madison. That's probably what we should have done under Governor Walker, because that would mean they would have to say that maybe Governor Walker was right on something. So you will be I can't imagine any of my Democratic colleagues expressing those words, which is a shame. I think that Amanda and the job that they did was to really look and say, how can we make the university stronger for the long term? Part of that could be more autonomy. Part of that is more specialization. Part of it is making sure that when we choose people to work on campus, they are selected on merit. We do not do merit any longer. They are selected for a whole lot of other reasons that are not making our university the strongest. I think there are a lot of things that we could do differently that hopefully this is just step one in a long chain to make the university better. But I think it was a great first step.
So moving on, President Riley basically said we'd be stronger together. He hired an interim chancellor, I think Chancellor Ward. I think the David Ward, his words were, it's got to have a calming effect on campus. And pardon me, that's on campus, that's a lingo for just sit tight, do nothing. Which is to say, don't make major investments. You're just interim, hang in there for 2 years. Tuition went up mechanically at 5.5% a year for a whole bunch of years, which led to reserves kind of growing over time. I've labeled that. I don't know who else has reserve gate. What were your thoughts at the time on this buildup of reserves, which was tuition, not really used, but at some level, these reserves provide insurance against the state not funding critical initiatives?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the frustration was that when Governor Doyle made a decision in a budget deficit to reduce funding for the university just sat there and said, well, that's a shame that you have to do that, but we understand times are tough. And they just accepted it and basically said very little to the legislature. The exact same thing happened 2 years later under Governor Walker, and you would think the world had come to an end. Same idea, same problem with the budget. Everything was the same except for who chose to be in the governor's office. It was incredibly partisan. So right away, everybody looked and said, wow, they've told us how the university is going to go bankrupt. Don't have enough funding. Then we learn shortly thereafter that they really had hundreds of millions of dollars in this reserve account they didn't want to touch, even though times were really tough. So the level of trust that I had as a former regent, I won't say I gave carte blanche, but I gave a great deal of deference to the university system because I trusted the Board of Regents, I trusted the chancellors to manage their universities. When all of a sudden the information came out somewhat in secret that they had almost $1 billion sitting around that they chose not to utilize and instead told us the draconian cuts that we put in because of the governor's budget, it really made the legislature sour in a way that really they deserved. They could have been honest. They could have said, yeah, you know what, we're going to use these reserves because you cut our budget, right? That would have been honest. But instead, they chose to cut programs, keeping all the money in reserve for what? A rainy day, right? When you have a cut, isn't that when the money was supposed to be utilized? I think most of us looked and said, this really isn't a budget stabilization. It's a slush fund to go on projects that they think are important. That's wrong. So I think that's the first real break that the legislature, myself included, had in the trust that we had given to the board and the system, which had probably been 2 or 3 generations long, where there was just a great deal of deference given. They chose to break that trust, and now they're dealing with the ramifications.
So I would push back a little bit on the tuition because during the Doyle era, what was remarkable to me was there were mechanical increases in tuition for 2 years when there was a big cut to the university system. I think Madison had an increase in tuition at 22 and 23 percentage points each year for 2 successive years, where the argument the Board of Regents used was this was incredibly important as a resource for the state. We need to make them whole, and so mechanically let's raise tuition. And then after the reserve gate, we went to a period of time where tuition was held flat in nominal terms for 10 years. I would argue that relative to the crime of reserve gate, which was not necessarily financial, at best financial mismanagement. Mismanagement in the following sense. I get a federal grant, I don't use up the money. It's dumb. Right? Why would I send money back? Why would I have it sitting in the kitty?
Because we have a deficit.
Because we have a deficit. Fair enough. No, but at this stage, though, so my own personal view is having a very strong form of a price control in terms of tuition. Kind of makes no sense, but I kind of want to get back to that. But I guess what I wanted to echo was we went from a period of time we were contemplating complete freedom, complete autonomy UW-Madison, to a period of time now where we're completely crippled. And why do you think that happens so fast at such a rapid clip relative to other institutions?
Well, one of the benefits of longevity is that you do have the ability to look back and say, I remember when. Okay, so I remember them telling us they had to raise tuition 20% because of the cut that was under Jim Dore, right? I didn't like the 20% tuition cut, but I also looked and said the university has to make a choice between cutting programs that they think are important and having students make an investment to make sure they have a quality education. Didn't like either option, but I guess if I had been on the board of regents, I probably would have said it's more important to preserve the programs than it is to cut the programs. Okay. The same thing happens 2 years later, where we have to do this cut, which was unfortunate because of the budget deficit we had. And we, like, again, let them make a tuition increase, as you said, double digit. To have this massive tuition increase over 4 years and then at the end find out there was really billions of dollars that could have avoided the tuition increase, how would you have reacted? You felt like you were fooled, tricked, and we look stupid because now we had students taking on debt because the university didn't want to use their slush fund. So I just feel like that was such a breach of trust that what else could we do? They had raised tuition by double digits for the 4 years before. They had more than enough tuition dollars. We froze it for a while. It probably stayed longer. I didn't favor keeping it on quite as long as we did because I do agree with the free market. It should be tuition based. It should be you pay for what you get. If something is free, it usually has less value than if something is paid for, right? You have a higher demand from the students to have quality. All those things should happen. But at the same time, there was just this feeling that the university never got the message. And I'm not sure they have yet.
I'll just make one other point and then move on to from history to reality. So this was right after some of the cuts that we got from Governor Walker. Chancellor Blank, I think, raised out-of-state tuition, couldn't raise in-state tuition, but dramatically increased the number of in-state students. In my view, that had a ripple effect in the rest of the system. So more kids coming to Madison, which is good for people in the state, but fewer kids going to the rest of the system, kind of contributing to enrollment decline. So the notion that, well, let's stay together and it would actually help other campuses, and it just seems dubious to me at best.
Yeah.
Let me get to President Rotman, who's been arguing accurately that we're 43rd in the nation in terms of, if you just look at the state appropriations, you divide by the number of student FTEs, look at every state, we're 43rd in the nation. Why is that in and of itself a compelling argument for the state of Wisconsin to better fund universities of Wisconsin?
It is. So I don't think it is.
So here's what I would say. So we ranked in the bottom half in terms of state funding forever, right? In my view, it's not a new phenomenon. The SHIO rankings that President Rotman kind of states it only goes back 5 years. If you look at the drop in state support relative to student FTE, it occurred almost entirely in 2 periods, between 2004 and 2008 under Doyle, that we just talked about, and between 2015 and 2019 under Walker. If I'm not mistaken, those are the second terms of both of the governors, right? So if you actually were to combine tech college funding with UW system funding, which in my view is the right metric to judge whether or not the Wisconsin taxpayer is stingy, there's no evidence to suggest that the Wisconsin taxpayer is stingy. States differ considerably in their use of tech colleges, or we don't have community colleges or four-year colleges. I suppose a long-winded way of just saying, well, if we're 43rd in the nation, they're 5th in the nation. Why does Wisconsin have such a love affair, great affinity for tech colleges relative to UW?
That's a good question. I think it's interesting because so Gateway is a tech college in my area. I know many people who have gone to Gateway. They do a good job. I have zero complaints at the quality of the product that they produce. I haven't met anybody who says, they wear a hat that has a Gateway emblem on it. Don't go to a game, or they don't talk about the alumni. It's just a different experience, right? So they do not have the same level of community engagement in a way that alumni would be supportive of the institution. So you would think the university would naturally have an inclination to have a higher level of support. What I do think is different is twofold. The business community has a much more direct impact on the tech college, and they are much more nimble. If XYZ Corporation is coming into Kenosha and they go to the tech college and say, we want you to create a curriculum to be able to put the trainees together in the next 6 months, they do the curriculum, and at the end of 6 or 9 months, they have people out the door ready to work. Universities don't do that. They don't develop a curriculum based on the need of an employer or a market segment. I think that's a challenge. I think the second thing is way that tech colleges are able to now take and have 2 years of university credit has really given an impetus to be able to say it's a cheaper way to help people get a 4-year degree. Whether it's right or wrong, you have an awful lot of folks taking the first 2 years at a tech college, transferring into a university, a totally different experience than the one that I had. Can't imagine not having on-campus experience, right? All the things that you get moving out of the house. But that's the reality that a lot of young people are doing to avoid college debt. So I think there is also a huge impetus to say it is an efficient way, a less expensive way for us to help cut the cost of a 4-year degree, because so many students are choosing the first 2-year option somewhere else as opposed to a traditional 4-year campus. And then lastly, it is the business model where, yes, someone who chooses to work in a tech college is part of the process of working on campus. But I think they are, my opinion, right or wrong, I think they are much more nimble. I think they are much more able to hire people in a field based on the need of the day and experience. Of course, they do have some guaranteed appointments where they can work at a tech college for life. But the worst thing that the university has going for it is tenure. If I could do one thing tomorrow, and I tried super hard, and I wish I would have tried a lot harder, should have eliminated tenure on every college campus in the University of Wisconsin. Giving somebody a guaranteed job for life with no accountability whatsoever means they are stale, and they usually do not do as good a job as somebody who at least has to make occasionally guaranteed reason to stay an employee. We don't do that. They do in the tech college system. They are much more nimble. If the program doesn't work, if the employer goes away, you know what happens? So does the faculty staff, right? So I think all of those things put together make me as a legislator to say it's a better investment, it's more nimble, and the business community is better connected to the results than the university system right.
I will say, out of personal gain, I'm so glad you failed in that initiative to remove tenure. And in terms of also defending, freedom of speech, it would be impossible
Guarantee
to
freedom of speech.
maybe
All that tenure does is guarantee freedom of laziness.
I'm fairly free to say what I want to say. No, in the sense of, imagine if you'd gotten rid of tenure, at least in my little cocoon, and I'm sure it's true in the entire university, we just wouldn't be able to hire. I think you just have to offer the same.
Wait a minute, you're saying that the free market, the only way someone will come and work 10 to 20 hours a week for $100,000 to $200,000 a year is that they're guaranteed to never get fired?
I am saying if every other campus is offering tenure and we don't, I can guarantee you we're out of the market.
Oh, only if you believe the only smart people have to have tenure. I think there are smart people everywhere who are able to teach, who are able to do research, because they do in the private sector. Because you know what? If you work for a pharmaceutical company, you get tenure. No, you get money and you get the ability to do an interesting job. If you work in the university, you don't even have to have market-driven research. You don't have to ever have somebody read your paper. It could be paid forever.
Happy to get rid of tenure if you would have tripled my salary. So that would be the economist version of it, which is impossible given my salary. But anyway, so in the last cycle, there was a small reallocation away from Madison to the rest of the system. And it raised a lot of questions about the allocation of resources within campus, across campuses. So what are your views on the allocation of GPR across campuses? And do you feel the Board of Regents should actually examine more into that allocation?
Well, when merger occurred, they basically took the appropriation of GPR and just let everybody keep what they had. Okay. UW-Madison, as the largest university and the one that at the time was the most politically connected, got the largest percentage of GPR. That number really never changed. When Ray Cross was here, he came to me and I tried, guess which campus out of the 13, it's the lowest percentage of GPR?
Yours.
Harvard of the Midwest, right? Does not get the appropriate number. If you look at the number of students per capita, if you look at the geography, the number of people who graduate, any metric you want to use, they are last. I don't think that's fair. So we tried very hard to say it should be based on per capita, some other criteria than just what was in 1970. He promised me at the time that we would do the new allocation, which we gave, which was some performance funding. I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it was in the tens of millions of dollars, that we would use that money and we would go under a new formula that the Board of Regents would determine. And again, at the time, trusting but verifying. I said, okay, that seems reasonable, Ray, let's do that. What do you think happened? Never allocated the money out of the new formula like they promised me. Never developed the new formula in front of the Board of Regents like they promised me. And where is the money going? To the same old formula that happened in 1970. Another example where promises were made, trust was given, and lies were told. So that's, I think, where there's such citizens. And so the last time where we gave out money, we should have given 0 to Madison. Right? Again, this is a person who likes U of A Madison. I have no problem with it, but this formula is inherently unfair. And we gave a little bit less to Madison than the rest of the campuses, but the rest of the campuses should have gotten a lot more under any form of fair formula.
So this is probably an issue that we've thought about a fair bit as economists. Right? What is it about the activities we do that deserve state support? Right. So most economists would argue research creates a significant externality, if you will. The walls of whatever we do far exceed our own boundaries of Bascom and so in terms of the recognition, when you think about what research is as opposed to education, in my view, education doesn't have as much of a public good component. Your kid gets into Madison, that's one less seat for my kid. Get it? So there's inherently a much stronger argument, in my view, which is also going on at the federal level with NIH funding cuts. But I would argue, in terms of at least the research support, the marginal impact of $1 of research support is significant when it comes to science, when it comes to R&D. It's been proven. And so the allocation, changing the allocation just on the basis of a metric, which is just state GPR relative to student FTE, in my view, is too simplistic. A vision of trying to equalize what Madison gets relative to the rest of the system.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, I would be happy to have that discussion to say, if there was a metric that said some amount of it should be tied toward research or overhead or something like that, I'd be open to that. But that's not how the formula was developed. It wasn't based on research or other criteria. Sure, that's reasonable. So I wish the Board of Regents, and I've asked for that, it hasn't happened. I wish the Board of Regents would actually have this discussion to say what's a better allocation based on something. Maybe it is research, maybe it's FTE, maybe it's number of children in poverty. I don't care what it would be, but at least to have that debate and discussion so we would have the ability to have an impact as opposed to just accepting something that happened 50 years ago.
I want to turn to price and capital controls. Bonding authority, something I've thought about a lot. To me, the big puzzle is, for the students in the room, we're the only major research university without direct access to capital markets or funding infrastructure projects, right? So if you want to build a dorm, you can pledge future dorm revenue. But if you want to build an engineering building, if you want to build a computer science building, you can pledge future program revenue. We would get a great credit rating, and we could have used low interest rates that prevailed over a long period of time in the last 2 decades or so. I view this as a big puzzle because I would have thought with bonding authority, we could rely less on the state. We could just pledge our own collateral, our own future as a collateral, and fund these really important projects. So forget about, I guess at this point, I guess the way I would phrase the question is, why didn't we get bonding authority like 15 years ago? I guess we would have got it with the public authority.
You would have gotten it with the public authority. So I think here's the concerns that folks raised, which I think were legitimate. Because there were other ones that I would say were less legitimate, but the ones that were legitimate. Number one, at the time, the assumption was that the state would always be the backstop. So if a decision was made, if a bond couldn't be fulfilled, ultimately the state of Wisconsin would pay for it anyways. So we were basically giving away the state's credit card and letting the university spend it with knowing that mom and dad eventually would pay for it. I think that was a big problem for folks to be able to say, we don't do that with anybody else. And then you add on top of it that today's light, the reason I do not support it, because I am concerned that whatever project was bid out, strings would be put on that enact a political agenda based on the ideology of the folks on campus, as opposed to the best interests of the state. So the cost of a building is double or triple because we choose to put DEI requirements on it. We choose to say we're only going to use this kind of labor. We choose to say we're only going to build on non-Indian land, whatever you want to say, right? All this crazy crap. I think the university would do that and it would significantly increase the cost. Ultimately, again, with the state as the one who ultimately has to bear the burden when the debt payment can't be made, they've made a bad decision with the way construction occurred, and then the taxpayers hold the hook. So wouldn't you want the elected officials who ultimately have to vote for the funding be the ones that make the decision. And if that's true, well, then they can't have bonding.
To me, still the puzzle, just to push you a little further, if you thought we misbehaved, you could still cut our GPR in the next cycle. It's still a dynamic game in that sense, isn't it?
It is, but it's a lot harder than that sounds. So the way that the budget in Wisconsin works is different than the way it works at the federal level. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. So at the federal level, the government runs out of money, right? You always hear this fiscal cliff where they're going to shut down the government and all these things happen. And then at the last minute, they get a deal and they put together this big omnibus bill that nobody ever reads and they all vote yes to save the government, right? Well, in Wisconsin, we have a process where if we never pass a budget again, it stays at the same level of funding as today. Well, technically, if we never pass a budget, it will always stay at today's level. It's pretty hard to cut funding if there's a guarantee that it always stays at the same level, unless all three agree on something, right? The other way it is it takes all three to agree on an increase. So of course, the legislature has more impact. But right now, I think it'd be very challenging, even with our whole deal. We said we were not going to fund the UW engineering building. The only leverage we had was to be able to try to get some very, very minor reforms done, which were accomplished, but they were very, very, very minor for an $800 million investment. So how much do you think it would take to get a major reform? Right? I just don't trust it'll ever happen.
8 billions.
Yeah. Yes.
So I want to turn to in-state tuition. I would argue, and I think I would disown any economist in this room who would argue against me, that there seems to be no good reason to me that our in-state tuition should be less than Minnesota, which is a legislative acceptable comparable, where we have a reciprocity arrangement. You can look at it in many different angles. You can look at it from the perspective of efficiency. You're a business owner. I don't think you want to be told by the state of Wisconsin you can't raise prices. You can look at it through the context of equality of opportunity. The word access is thrown around a fair bit. The ironic thing is, if in fact our tuition were to go up by a couple of $1,000s at the very least, that's what I think it should. That's what I tell my students when I teach intermediate macro. 40% of that goes towards financial aid. So at some level, you're actually hurting financial aid by our inability to have the wealthier students cross-subsidize the poorer counterparts. If your notion is equity, equity in the sense of the left's version of equity, which is to equalize outcomes, it's still the case that you don't want to overburden high school grads to pay for college grads who are going to earn more than them over the course of their lifetime. So what are your views on, at this stage? I know we talked about tuition right after ReserveGate, but why not just have Madison increase tuition to the rate at the level of Minnesota?
That's a really good point. I think we should just give the power to the Board of Regents to do it, which we already did.
I know you did. I know you're
Regents already has that
punting on
power.
that question,
Yeah,
but
they already has that power.
yeah. So if they were to do it, you would not be annoyed?
Well, it depends on where the money would go, right? Do they have a huge reserve and instead they're just choosing to build up a slush fund? Are they using it for programs that really don't benefit the students and benefit their own ideology? I mean, it all depends on where the money goes, right? I mean, that's the rub.
All right. DEI. Very politicized topic on both sides of the aisle. I'd say traditional arguments for DEI or diversity and equity, where inclusion is fine. So I want to focus on diversity and equity. Okay. The traditional arguments for diversity, I would argue, would be correction for past injustices, role model effects, or kind of having more of a cognitively diverse team. In the last cycle, what was your goal in focusing on DEI issues at UW-Madison? And what is the problem and what do you think needs to change?
What is the single most underrepresented minority in the UW-Madison campus? Americans? Probably. Why? We denying them access? Do they not get financial aid?
Are barriers to access.
It was a barrier because they're Native American? What's the barrier? Is it because they don't have access?
Autumn is. Always focus on that one. Yes. The way that government lacks empathy. That's our state government. Have barriers. Let's talk about the redlining. A lot of barriers to access. Ask you a question today.
Sorry, could we please go on?
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
thank
Yeah,
you.
keep going.
Thank you.
So the
Yeah.
point that I was trying to make is that most of the issues that the young lady just brought up aren't really related to race, related to poverty, related to access to institutions of higher learning and grade schools and universities and having a two-parent family. But none of those are directly related to people's race, right? Because you know why? There are poor white people. There are white people who go to a school where they have really low graduation rates. And you know what? If we only focus on race, we are doing a disservice to the entire country and the university system. So I started with the idea of saying that I want to make sure that people have access to go to a university because they are worthy, right? And when I say worthy, I mean smart enough, right? We need to have people, we don't let folks in who have a 10 on their ACT because they won't be successful, right? We need to figure out where do we balance it, right? But if somebody has the same ACT score, it shouldn't matter what zip code they came from, what ethnicity they are, or what challenges they had to get there, because they have every right to sit in that seat and become successful on their own. That should be the standard that we have. And somehow we've changed it from saying that a poor white person has somehow less need to be on campus than someone who chooses to be on campus, who's Native American or a different minority, but perhaps comes from a very different socioeconomic status. Using race as any criteria hurts people in the long run. And that's why DEI, in my mind, is totally misinformed when it's focused on race. I have said over and over and over, if someone is focused on poverty or a single parent family or any of the criteria that in my mind are real, that is one where I think most society could gather together and say, why wouldn't we give a leg up to everybody race neutral? I think that would be something that 70 or 80% of the country could get behind. But instead, we've chosen to say that the main criteria is the race that you were born by two loving parents that gave birth to you, right? That in my mind is wrong. And when the university says the only thing that matters in an awful lot of programs is your race, they're doing a disservice to society for the next 20, 30, or 40 years by making think that race is the only thing that guarantees success or failure. It's just wrong.
I want to separate DEI in terms of students, DEI in terms of faculty.
Sure.
So we're in a different world now with affirmative action, the ruling from SCOTUS. But if you think about DEI programs on campus, many of these DEI programs are really to try to make sure that you cater to different student experiences, right? The kind of experiences, the kind of pathway that you need to have a poor white kid from rural Wisconsin succeed might be very different from the kind of pathway that an African-American kid from inner city Milwaukee. And so why is it not appropriate then to offer these customized experiences? I don't know what we call it, so I don't care what you call it, but it's more, one way to view it, I would have guessed, is just to say, these are customized experiences. We want to set our students up for success.
That is dramatically different. So I would say, think of tutoring, right? Some kids need tutoring in math, some kids need tutoring in reading, and other kids need tutoring in science. No one says that because you need it in science, you shouldn't get it in math. Right. So I have no problem in saying that if somebody has a special circumstance because of their background, that they should not be given extra tools to succeed. It shouldn't be based on their race. It should be based on the actual circumstances in which they live, not the perception of something that happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago that might be real, but it might not be real. And we're just creating a stereotype that's wrong. So I think there are ways to solve similar or the same problems. But the idea that we're going to virtue signal to make ourselves feel better The idea that every time you have a speaker come to campus, you're going to have somebody stand up and read a platform saying that this used to be Indian land 500 years ago. What is the point of that? Other than making people feel like there's something wrong with the fact that a mistake was made 500 years ago that we can't correct, right? We're not going to give the land back. So what do we do by making that statement other than trying to inject race into a discussion about whatever it would be? So I just think all this virtue signaling does nothing but create further racial tension. It creates further destruction and division in society. It's what's going to end up ruining our country if we don't figure out how to deal with the real underlying issue, which is almost always economic circumstances, not racial ones.
Gallup polls found recently that once again, only 36% of Americans have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher ed. The number of those saying they have very little confidence has grown from 22 to 32% this past year. Gallup asked them why, and the number one answer was political agendas. Do you think this contributed to the decline in trust in general across America and in Wisconsin that Americans have in higher ed?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so I don't know the number of professors that I had at UW-Whitewater, but let's just say it was 30 over the time. Only one or two did I know what their political leanings actually were. I always think I know where they are, or I believe that they are a liberal or a conservative, but I had no idea where most of them were. You know what that's called? Good education, because you should not be injecting your personal beliefs into the classroom at the grade school level, at the high school level, or the college level. I had professors that I am certain were conservative that challenged liberals in class to make them smarter. I had conservatives who were challenged by liberals that made them smarter, but none of them were ever made to feel stupid. I think what happens in an awful lot of classrooms now is that people make the other side feel stupid. And you know what happens when you make somebody feel stupid? They get defensive and they stop listening and they stop learning. And that's where an awful lot of universities have gotten. We don't have the free exchange of ideas where you have the right to be wrong and so do I, right? We have the right to challenge each other because I respect who you are as a person. I'm never going to say you're dumb. I'm going to say you're misguided. But an awful lot of people today in class, as I hear my interns, I observe people, they spend an awful lot of their time denigrating other people for what they believe, thinking they must be stupid because no one who's smart could ever believe that. What if we just have a difference of opinion? And I think that's where we have gotten in society, where most Americans look and say, as opposed to the idea, which used to be smart people arguing to come up with the best outcome, maybe a compromise, we end up having people yelling at each other and walking away more angry. People that's not going to work. And I think that the more the university does that, the more that it chooses sides in every debate. And the challenge is, look, as a conservative, I will here admit, not every idea that conservatives have is perfect. Okay. Some of our things I think are great. Some I a little question, right? They're nothing perfect. But how can it be that on the college campus, with the exception of Ananth and a few others, I have never seen people from the university coming out saying, wow, these Republicans, damn, they have a good idea. You know what they come out saying? Whatever a Republican says is wrong. And they have a whole bunch of academic studies and analytical crap and all this stuff to prove why it's wrong, but they don't do it on the other side. Now, if both sides are being criticized, okay, I might not like it, but I could accept it. If both sides are being praised occasionally, you might not like it, but you could accept it. But when all the bias is on one side of the ledger, makes it very difficult for the public to say they're intellectually honest, they're doing the rigorous research they say they are, or they are giving me the taxpayers' worth. So I think the university is doing, it's creating its own self-fulfilling prophecy where they are underlying public support, and it's going to ruin the university system. And as somebody who cares about higher education, it is going to be awful for our society. We need super smart people that do research. We need people who challenge the status quo, but we also need people who are fair enough to say that occasionally the other side is right. And I don't see people on the campus ever doing that. They only focus on their own ideology and their own agenda and proving that they are correct and so is their side.
What was your objective when you got rid of the top target of opportunity program for faculty hiring? What do you think Wisconsin could do more, UW-Madison could do more for viewpoint diversity? The one conservative hire that you had as part of that deal, wasn't it just DEI for conservatives?
Oh, I mean, so here's the difference, right? No, here's what I wanted. We talked about this in our caucus. So look, I do not believe in racial affirmative action. Okay, there is a difference. Affirmative action can be multifaceted. The stereotype in society is that affirmative action is race-based. Okay, that is where it has unfortunately gotten to in the world. But the idea of affirmative action doesn't have to be race-based. It could be economic-based. It could be veteran status. It could be first-generation college student. It could also be ideological. What if we had intellectual diversity and affirmative action to guarantee that at least one person in every single faculty division was a minority? You would say that's great, right? We have to guarantee that we have some kind of racial diversity in our academic freedom, right? What about having men and women? Should we have a guarantee that there should be both men and women in every school of thought? Yes, we should. But it's kind of become normal in society. But you know the one guarantee that we don't have? Intellectual diversity. What if we had affirmative action for intellectual diversity so that every single school on campus had at least one conservative? One. Would that be awful? It can't happen. They tried to hire one conservative professor in the School of Law, and it was one vote short. The faculty, why did they not hire that person? Because they disagreed with their ideology. That just proved my point, that you can't have intellectual diversity if the people who are choosing to hire someone only reject them based on what they think. How is that different than rejecting somebody based on their sexuality because they're gay? How is it different rejecting somebody based because they're African American or because they're an immigrant? It is no different. But nobody on campus had any kind of outrage for the fact that the faculty voted to not hire somebody because they were a conservative. And it again proves the point that the only thing that is allowable discrimination on campus is if you have a different viewpoint than the one that's predominant here.
Last question on DEI. Do you mind if you go over 5 minutes?
We can take it. We can take questions. Sure.
No. I have a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
I do want to get to a happier place. So I would just offer this on DEI. It's a controversial issue, but I would argue two things. We are mercenary as a university, like any other business.
Mhm.
The private sector wanted it, demanded it. Private sector would come in and say, if you do not have a diverse student body, I am not going to come to UW-Madison to interview your kids. So we didn't have a choice in terms of catering to the private sector. The federal government wanted it. We're doing really well, $1.7 billion last year in terms of funding. And the federal government, the NIH, NSF, they had effectively mandates about, let's say, DEI. Now, given that that's kind of turning around pretty quickly, corporate America is turning away from DEI pretty quickly, do you see an automatic course correction that's going to happen anyway? As a virtue of which Speaker Voss can say, I don't care about DEI anymore because it's going to naturally take its course.
So here's the difference. I bet when the Trump administration put out the edict that would say that if you are here illegally, you are going to be deported, right? That is the law. It's actually already the law, just so we all understand that. Did the universities say, well, we have to follow the law, but we just have to do whatever the federal government tells us? We're going to have to cooperate with ICE. We're going to have to deport all the students that are here illegally. That's what the federal government says. They will not. They're actually already putting out student information as to how you avoid ICE. So the university picks and chooses which laws it wants to follow based on its own ideology. That's the problem. So when the DEI folks came and said a couple companies said you need to be more diverse, all of a sudden the university said, what amount of money can we spend to be able to put in the ideology that we already want? And they did that, right? The federal government, then the Biden administration wins. They put in all these DEI requirements. And what did the university say? Hey, all this stuff we've always wanted to do forever anyways, we're now being required to by the federal government. So we got to spend whatever it takes, to follow the federal law. As soon as the Trump administration comes in with a different agenda, it says, hey, got to deport all these people who are here illegally, got to follow the law. Did the university allocate a penny to say, let's put more money into campus security? Let's figure out how we're going to cooperate with ICE. Where are we going to hold students here illegally? Never. Because again, it is all about ideology and the university. It's why the public, going back to your point, it's why public perception of the university is continuing to decline, but it's not about following the rule of law. It's about following the rule of the ideology of the folks in charge.
Public support for UW lies at an all-time low, if you look at market polls, right? But I would argue as an economist, the return to investing in UW-Madison, UW system on the whole, especially UW-Madison, is sky high. I don't like the $1 becomes $23 where alchemy, 2,200% rate of return, but there are other ways to measure it. So why do we then get so much less love than any other state agency? terms of funding.
I think we just spent an hour on that.
Okay. So let me put it this way then. What do you think needs to happen so that we could get to a happier place where the state of Wisconsin trusts the University of Wisconsin like they did a few decades ago? With more transparency and accountability, perhaps.
How did Wisconsin vote in the last presidential election? Almost 50-50, exactly. How did it vote 4 years prior? Almost 50-50. How did it vote 4 years prior to that? Correct. All true. How does the University of Wisconsin choose to conduct itself in a 50-50 state? Is it 50-50? Is it close to 50-50? Does it try to find ways to reach out to people who maybe disagree? Does it find any value in having folks of a different viewpoint have a position of prominence on campus to have their viewpoint espoused to maybe challenge the status quo? No. So that's the inherent underlying have to be fixed problem or nothing's going to change. We're in a 50-50 state, in a 50-50 country, in a zip code that is 80-20, pushing for 90-10. That zip code is totally unrepresentative of the rest of Wisconsin, right? It would be as if I governed as if the village of Oostburg, which is one of the highest Republican wards in the entire state of Wisconsin, was the norm. That is how you are choosing to govern UW-Madison and the UW system. So until that changes, until people look and say, hey, the 50% of Republicans who voted for the guy that I didn't want, or the 50% of people who voted for the person who lost have a valid viewpoint that should be respected, that should be listened, and occasionally might be right, you're going to be at an all-time low with the public and with the legislature who represents the people of Wisconsin.
Well, that's fair. I would still argue, I would just make one suggestion. We're probably in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution with artificial intelligence and affecting, we could well be in the roaring 20s, just mimicking the roaring 1920s. Many other states are making significant investments in AI, public-private type partnerships. So I hope that that's one of the, at least the things that you would consider just for the societal good of the state of Wisconsin.
I am certainly open to that. Again, is AI unbiased? Or do you create an AI that has inherent biases built in it that doesn't allow it to actually be responsive to where the public is, right? I was talking to one of my colleagues today who said that he had to go through 4 different AI systems to find one that did not have the bias to make sure that he could get answers that he viewed to be neutral. Well, even AI is being, because primarily, not always, but primarily it's being developed on a university campus, which has its own biases that are built into the system that are then inherently, basically exported to the rest of the world, because you're not allowed to type certain things into ChatGPT, right? Because it says it's not allowed. It's not part of the algorithm. Why is that? Because somebody who wrote the program decided it wasn't allowable in society. Well, it's not really open if certain people are deciding what's allowed and what's not. Kind of like having the university where they only get to pick certain topics that certain people can talk about. So if AI is truly open and revolutionary, I think you would have universal and bipartisan support. If it's going to a university that is 90-10 with a bias in every single faculty member and the ideology being reflected in how they perform their work, it'd be pretty hard for folks to invest in it, knowing that the outcome is going to be biased.
I think there are a couple of really good computer scientists in the audience, so I'll let you have the conversation
Yeah.
over the nacho bar, but I think we're over time. I want to thank the speaker with a lot of appreciation for you to spend your evening with us. Please join me in thanking the speaker and on Wisconsin.
You want to take questions?
Do you want to?
I don't mind. It's up to you. You can. I mean, we could take 10 minutes in questions. I don't really care. It's up to you. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sure. Sure. So just so everybody understands, because I think probably most of you do, but if an institution, it's not just universities, there's organizations that I'm involved in get federal grants. So if a federal grant comes, there is a negotiated amount of how much is allowed to go directly into the research that you're paying for and how much is allowed to go to other expenses that might be related. So I think the university is roughly 50-50. So if they get $1 million grant, 50% has to go to pay for the researchers and the direct work that the grant was written for. And 50% is allowed to go toward the overhead of the university. Okay. If you think about that, I understand why folks are concerned, but the dollar amount is the same. How much is allowed to go into overhead and how much is required to go into research? So if $1 million comes to UW-Madison and the requirement is now only $150,000 can go to overhead and $850,000 has to go to research versus the current rule, which is 50% or 500,000 goes to research and 50% or 500,000 goes to overhead. It's actually an increase in funding for direct research. And that's just do the math, right? It's basic. Now, if you can't justify that you have $1 million to spend on research, you're going to get less money. That is true. I think it's going to mean more dollars going directly to the researcher who's focusing on fighting cancer. It's going to go directly to the researcher who says, I want to find a cure for Alzheimer's, and less going toward the DEI administrator or the folks who are going to focus on what the cost of building maintenance is and all the other things. I mean, 15% is pretty much a standard in the private sector grant writing side. The state of Wisconsin and the federal government at 50%, that is pretty far outside the norm. I don't know if 15% is the right number. That might be a negotiated number. The idea that half of every grant is only going to research, I think when most of the public learns that, so that doesn't seem to be right. So hopefully there will be some kind of a reasonable number, but I don't think the idea of keeping the status quo is actually better for research.
I would just add, if you don't mind, a couple of things on this. The dollars that go into the NIH, this might be the highest rate of return activity ever.
Mhm.
There are economists who have estimated it. In fact, Chris, he probably doesn't want to raise his hand for fear, but he and I, as the chair of the econ department, we're working on a paper that shows you can have a different view about how the overheads have to be spent, for sure. But the return to a dollar, even if you not take into account societal benefits, this is like, so this nerdy paper looks at the impact of drugs on patents and just the impact.
NIH is
A
fantastic.
dollar becomes like $2.80.
100%.
So
Yeah.
this is not even, so even if you were to account for the overheads, I mean, there's an incredible rate of return associated with that.
Wouldn't the rate of return be more if more was spent directly on research and less was spent?
The question is, so I'm a market economist. The question is, what are the frictions in play? To me, there are two. One is an externality, which is the reason why we fund research. But the other friction is the indivisibility. I was actually talking to someone earlier yesterday where, you know, you need a building, you need a lab. You can't rent it. You don't have rental markets where you say, imagine you need refrigeration services. It's hard to rent a refrigerator. There's also a bit of smoothing of payment. So I concur with you that I think we need to think a bit about how the overheads are structured. There's a lot of inequality in overheads. Like Stanford or Harvard gets about 70% overheads, right? Poor states actually get no overheads. If you are North Dakota and you want to set up a lab, it's really hard because you know, Harvard has been investing in these for a long period of time.
The other thing is, if the research is historical, where you were doing more research-based, where you're doing academic research, you probably need a lower level of overhead than perhaps where you have a lab,
Possibly.
you have all those things, but it's all the same. That is probably an inherently flawed model because it was developed that way, I think 40 or 50 years ago when they started NIH. So I don't think the idea of having a reform and how we look at it is as consequential as people say. Now, of course, if you start up by saying Donald Trump is evil and everything that he does is bad, you end up at the same result. Now, I'm not saying that this proposal is perfect. I don't know enough about it, but I also think that the idea of trying to direct more money into direct research should not be something that we fear. It should be something that we say, okay, there's some points to that. How do we make it better? How do we improve it? Not just start up by saying it's going to kill people. It's going to hurt cancer research. All those things aren't even necessarily true. They're just the easiest hot button issues to say because we don't know that that's a fact. Okay? Well, part of the challenge that I see is allowing the faculty to hire their own colleagues. That is the single most, I mean, imagine if we said in we did, okay, in 1920, that the faculty got to decide that it was only men who were qualified to teach on this campus. And we let that system perpetuate itself all the way until now. That is exactly the system that we have for ideological diversity. Imagine if we said that only married Catholics got to vote on who the next person coming in was. You probably would get less people who were Jewish. You would probably get less people who are atheist. That's not right. It should be based on the qualifications of the person coming in. So I think that somehow we have to have a discussion that says all diversity is good. Ethnic, background, ideology, and sexual orientation, all those matter. And I think that right now we've decided that the only one that doesn't matter is ideological diversity, because again, it's more comfortable the way it was 100 years ago, people who wanted to discriminate against women, or 50 years ago who wanted to get discriminated against people who were gay. And we've gotten over those things, thank goodness. We have the last barrier to cover, which is getting over intellectual diversity by saying everyone's viewpoint is valid, just like everyone can love who they love and be a person that they want to be. Can't say that with certain things, and it's a shame.
One last question. There was a student back there.
So what? I'm sorry.
Generacy.
Oh, degeneracy. Okay. I'm kind of a libertarian. So I kind of believe that the idea should be that we really shouldn't promote any certain morality through government in general. I think we have to do things like protect human life. I mean, I'm pro-life. There are things like that. But I think ultimately people have to make wise choices. So I think the way that I look at it is we shouldn't be promoting any of those things, right? Regardless of the background is. We should be focusing on things that actually are educational, not scintillating, which is I think what a lot of things are.
Stop.
I could take one last question.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, because the way I'm looking at it is the federal government allocates a certain dollar amount to NIH. So less going to overhead means more grants, more money going to direct research. I think in the long run, it will result in more research. I really believe it.
Do we have nachos?
It's up to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.